Hey, what's up, everybody? Joe Moore back at you from Psychedelics today. Today on the show, Kyle isn't able to join, but it's a great episode nonetheless. We have Dr. Ben Malcolm, professor of pharmacy at Western University. Very great conversation, in my opinion. We talk a lot about Ibogaine, his recent Ibogaine paper, using a interesting scale that I don't think has been used previously with Ibogaine research. So very cool to see that data and talk to him about it. I think you really enjoy the show. So yeah, before we dig in, just a reminder, if you want to help us out, leave us a review on iTunes, Facebook, Stitcher. We're now available on Google Podcasts. That's a new app that just came out, so check us out there. We're also on Spotify now, which is a huge win for us. And yeah, if you want to check it out and give us some love, check us out there and maybe spread the word. If you really, really want to help us out, check out our shop. We got all sorts of merch on there, and we sell a class called Navigating Psychedelics that we put together that covers all sorts of aspects of drug harm reduction and education and how to maybe even get something beneficial out of your psychedelic use. So it is really comprehensive, and I think you'll love it. It features 12 master classes from all sorts of experts all over the psychedelic landscape, and really think you're going to like it if you do. If you feel like that's a little risky, we got a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you hate it, feel free to let us know and return it. And we are happy to oblige. So yeah, here we go. Dr. Ben Malcolm. Enjoy the show, everybody. Bye. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Joe Moore here. Today on the show, we have Dr. Ben Malcolm, professor of pharmacy at Western University School of Pharmacy. So thanks for joining us, Ben.
Thanks so much, Joe, for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Can't wait to dig in. So we met at very briefly, I guess, at the Psychedelic Science Conference at the Symposia Arena or Pavilion. I forget what they called it, but it was great chatting with you there. And I knew there was going to be some really interesting conversations coming in our future. You recently, I think, published this paper on Ibogaine and withdrawal symptoms. And that's, I guess, kind of the major thing we wanted to chat about here on the show. Can you give us a little rough outline about what that paper was?
Sure. So I'm sure that some of your audience is already familiar with Ibogaine, but an alkaloid from the Iboga plant. And this alkaloid is psychedelic, but also seems to have some incredible potential for treating addictions. And it's been most associated with the treatment of opioid addiction. So we wanted to look at the results of a treatment center that had implemented a week-long detoxification program utilizing Ibogaine. And this was potentially a little bit, I don't know, not different, but perhaps expanded compared to some previous reports and previous articles about Ibogaine, in that the clinic was utilizing a couple of withdrawal rating scales. So one of them was a COWS, or a clinician opioid withdrawal scale. So this is something that the clinic physician would administer to the residents that were undergoing detoxification, both before and after their Ibogaine treatment. And then to supplement what the physician was seeing, there's also a subjective opioid withdrawal scale that the client themselves would fill out, as well as a craving scale. So these are the same validated instruments or tools that would be used in any other study of opioid detoxification with other agents like methadone or buprenorphine. Ibogaine really seems to be different than those other agents in that although it can bind to opioid receptors, it doesn't really elicit the typical opioid types of effects like the pinpoint pupils or the severe constipation or the respiratory depression that is associated with opioids and unfortunately probably the reason that so many people are overdosing at the moment. So it's able to bind with opioid receptors in a way that seems to sort of attenuate withdrawal symptoms, but there's so much biology to Ibogaine as a molecule. It's incredibly interesting and binds to a number of different receptors inside the brain. So besides being able to kind of mitigate the withdrawal symptoms, it also seems to attenuate the craving or the psychological types of withdrawal symptoms. And this is incredibly important because you can physically detoxify somebody perhaps from opioids, but they're left with the residual craving or the psychological urge to continue using opioids, which sometimes brings them back. And of course, when you're craving opioids but don't have a tolerance anymore, then the risk of overdoses is increased further. So I guess in summary, we used some validated rating tools to measure the course of the people that were going through this week-long Ibogaine detoxification, and found that the withdrawal scores as well as the craving scores decreased after the Ibogaine experience at a time when, if they weren't given Ibogaine, you would expect someone to be essentially in the peak of their withdrawal symptoms.
Yeah, that's awesome. I really appreciated how you got that through without the IRB thing, because
we did actually submit it through an IRB. Anytime you have to do human subjects research, it's a good idea to at least run it past an IRB. Have that, there's an IRB set up at the university. This project was using retrospective data, so it's data that had already been in existence just from clinic records. And then when we extracted the data from the medical record, we did it in a way that it preserved anonymity. And this allowed us to get an exemption as far as an informed consent. So the study was reviewed by an IRB, but was ultimately deemed to be exempt from a full board review.
Well, that's really cool. That's helpful. We've been having some debates on the show lately about how it's a harsh word, but monopoly, how like universities and IRBs seem to have like a monopoly on anybody doing research. So citizen scientists are a little at odds to participate. But I think it's cool that, if we play by certain rules, we could at least do pilot studies as citizen scientists and, hopefully inform university scientists that would later go and get approved research published. It's a complicated issue, though, I know.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps it's an unintended consequence of a process, but I mean, the IRB is really in place to protect human subjects because there have been examples in history in which there were deception or perhaps unethical elements to experiments. And oftentimes, researchers are very focused on their results, and it's actually really easy to overlook some of these things. And the IRB is really in place just to review your methods and make sure that everything you're doing really is in the best interest of the subjects instead of the experiment or the science. Just to kind of piggyback off of that, though, I mean, I am working at the university and do have access to their IRB. So, if there's people out there that have data that perhaps aren't so confident in writing it up or perhaps looking for an IRB to submit through, then that is something that, is a potential collaboration, I guess, as far as that's exactly the type of data I'm looking for, is perhaps data from retreat centers that, have been sort of collected naturalistically, perhaps, and now the person's kind of looking to do something with it, but not exactly sure where to start. I think I would be a great contact for that type of situation.
Yeah, I would like to encourage people to do that as well. I started making friends down at Arizona State in Tempe, and turns out they have a really relaxed IRB, and they're like totally fine with a lot of things that would be of interest to us in the psychedelic space. They don't yet have a medical school, I don't think, so that's a little tricky, but it doesn't mean that science can't get done. They have plenty of science departments down there, and there could be some really interesting stuff coming out of there soon with psychedelics today's help, and maybe we'll keep talking to you as well, and maybe we can coax some more people to share data with you.
Yeah, because I think that's just it, is that in the in the psychedelic space, we've really been restricted and perhaps even oppressed as far as the type of data that we can collect, or the medical research that's being done around the drugs themselves. And, a potential way to begin filling that gap, even in the absence of legalization, is perhaps to look at some jurisdictions in the world where these drugs are legal or perhaps unregulated or kind of quasi-legal, and there are retreat centers in place and people are actually using them. So this kind of observational or naturalistic data perhaps doesn't have the strongest methodology as far as what the FDA is looking for like a drug approval or something like that, but it certainly does help to build an evidence base and a rationale for funding the type of research that the FDA is ultimately looking to evaluate.
Right. Absolutely. So have you had any particular reaction to your paper regarding Ibogaine? Are people excited? Are people more cautious? Because, we know it's not the safest of psychedelics. There are harms and risks. But when you're a severe opiate addict, perhaps it's worth taking that risk to get clean and get your life back.
Yeah, so I mean, overall, the reactions that I've had to the paper have been positive so far, and I really think that what you mentioned is so important with talking about Ibogaine as an entity in particular, in that it seems that there are risks associated with taking Ibogaine that are maybe a little bit greater than something like psilocybin mushrooms. And there have been reports of cardiac deaths or potential cardiotoxicity in relation to Ibogaine, and it doesn't always happen in a recreational setting. We've actually seen, deaths at treatment centers, or, people that are, taking Ibogaine in a clinical setting. Maybe there's room for protocol improvement, but the fact that we are seeing, such a severe adverse outcome like death, even in a clinical setting, I think really encourage us and makes us tread very cautiously in the space with Ibogaine moving forward. I think the flip side of that is you have to place the risks of the drug in the context of the illness itself. And opioid use disorder, as you're aware, is really affecting the United States and North America fairly severely right now. And, to my knowledge, I can find about 30-something odd reports of Ibogaine-related death in the literature. However, according to the CDC, or Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in 2016, something between 90 and 110 Americans were dying every single day due to opioids. The existing treatments, for example, methadone would kind of be perhaps the primary drug, or buprenorphine, also have their opioid drugs. They have risks of abuse, and methadone even has a black box warning for risk of abuse and respiratory depression. So it seems that opioid use disorder is a fairly deadly type of illness, and some of the treatments that we would consider to be first-line recommendations right now are also potentially very risky. So even though Ibogaine does have considerable safety concerns that should not be glossed over or taken lightly, it does seem that when you kind of look at how bad it is as far as an epidemic out there, that further research would probably be justified from just a risk-benefit perspective.
Yeah, I love the conservative language. Probably justified. I'm like, absolutely justified. Because I was just chatting with a person cutting my hair yesterday, and their brother was part of a huge court case up here where, now we're getting into policy, unfortunately, sorry. But this guy effectively committed suicide by smoking a fentanyl patch. The dealer, whoever, his friend who sold it to him, gave him the heads up, hey, you do this, you're going to die. So probably don't do it, but here's how you can do it if you want to. So it's kind of crazy. That dude that told him that got brought up on murder one charges. Unbelievable to me. But, it's just so close. I believe opiate overdose is like the number one cause of death now for people 18 to 24, for young people, for the longest time, it was just car accidents, which is pretty creepy anyway. But yeah, now opiate. So we are in the midst of a real crisis. Seatbelts aren't going to fix this one. And, we kind of need all hands on deck to do research on all the various avenues to sort this thing out. Hopefully we can save a lot of lives. Like, obviously there's the policy stuff, like how Switzerland and Portugal handle it. And we're not doing a great job there, but there are going to be these cool drugs coming up like Ibogaine and hopefully some similar compounds that are easier to administer, but we don't know that yet. Is there anything similar that you're aware of to Ibogaine in terms of like action?
Well, there are. Oh my gosh, I forget the name for it, but it's
okay. It's really obscure.
No, it's actually not that obscure because that was just it. Is that people found this opioid kind of addiction treatment effect of Ibogaine and thought, hey, like there's something to this, and that's another kind of piece of potentially drug development is that you can take a scaffold like Ibogaine and create some novel analogs and potentially find something that has the anti-addictive potential of Ibogaine that maybe doesn't have the cardiotoxic types of effects. A lot of researchers would also say, we could find something that works on addiction like Ibogaine, except doesn't have the psychedelic effect. Like some people are looking at the psychedelic effect like an undesirable side effect. I mean, my kind of personal belief is that the kind of meta phenomena as far as the psychological state that it renders is actually an important part of the treatment itself, and that the reflective space that a psychedelic like Ibogaine opens up for the person with a substance use disorder has a lot of merit. So from my personal perspective, I don't believe that that's necessarily the direction that the research should head in. But at the same time, I'm open to testing a compound that doesn't have a psychedelic effect that maybe has some of the same anti-addictive effect and see if it works, because until we test it, it's just my belief, right?
Well, right. But you have a little bit of basis to suspect that. It's the tryptamine, right? And we have other tryptamines that are kind of showing that the larger the quote-unquote mystical experience, the greater the healing. I think some of that stuff's coming out of Hopkins, probably other universities as well. So it's in this same class of drugs. So in your position, you have to be very deliberate around your language and what you say. But, we have this data saying similar classes of drugs have X result leading to, Y actual healing or whatever. So perhaps.
Sure. I guess maybe to rephrase a little bit.
Sure.
I do think that that it is important, but again, like exactly, if you could develop a ketamine that doesn't create a dissociative type of effect, like it would just be worth testing, really, just to kind of determine, exactly, like which piece of the healing is mediated through a mystical type of consciousness, and which piece is perhaps mediated through other mechanisms that don't necessarily involve an altered state of consciousness. Because my guess is that there's a little bit of both, and we're kind of figuring out which ones are the most important parts, and which parts are maybe more dispensable.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I guess this is one of the problems with science is we want to test everything because we could test everything given infinite time and money. So it's how do we get a little utilitarian? Like how do we just get the healing to people sooner and reduce harm? It's unfortunate that we can't do all the studies because we want to know everything.
Right, and I would have to say I'm guilty of this, but it seems like every science paper always concludes that, well, this is very promising, or we found something pretty cool and neat, but more research is needed. More research is needed. Is kind of always calling for more research. And when you're talking about giving drugs to humans, that's probably not bad to be kind of conservative like that. But then I think you're right. Like, at the same time, there's also a pressure out there to bring things to market that work for people. And it seems that, when you look at an opioid crisis where there's, millions of people with a substance use disorder and, over 100 people just in the United States dying every single day, that it seems like, wow, the burden of suffering is so large there. The unmet treatment need is so large there. Yeah, why are we not, jumping on this?
Absolutely. Why is it not yet all hands on deck, and instead, like, how many more people can we put in prison for life? It's a weird thing.
Yeah, and I think that Ibogaine is really just kind of one piece of it, right? Like, I don't think Ibogaine is necessarily going to solve the opioid use epidemic, and I don't even think Ibogaine is a magic bullet really for opioid use disorder. I think it probably takes somebody that is ready to stop using opioids or kind of sick of them in their life. There has to be some type of internal spark or motivation for wanting to stop. And then, okay, you can do a detoxification treatment with Ibogaine and get clean in a week or so. But, what are you going to do afterwards? Are you going to come back to your life with the exact same pieces, the exact same situations, the exact same friends? Because, if you are, then your chances of relapse, in my opinion, are probably a lot higher than, if you are probably needing to make some changes in the way you live your life to keep the results sustainable. And just from a public health perspective, it really seems that what we learned from, I'm not sure if you've ever talked about like the rat park experiments on this show, as far as, if you just have a rat in solitary confinement and give it drugs or food and water, it kind of picks drugs. And we took away from this that drugs are, irresistible and will kind of make you forgo food and water and things like that. But they've kind of repeated that experiment in a park where you have all of these different types of different ages and recreational equipment, little logs and branches and things that rodents enjoy. And you find in that setting that not very many of the rats actually pick the drugs, and a lot of them will just go with food and water in that scenario. So it sort of suggests to me that there's some element of disconnection that people are experiencing in society that makes us feel much more like the rat in solitary confinement than the rat that's really free and has a lot of rat friends and places to play. So, if we're talking, Ibogaine it's just on the treatment side. People already have the illness by the time you even think about using something like Ibogaine. And really on the prevention side, it seems that we need more alternatives for recreation in society. We need to reduce the amount of poverty that we have. We need to, provide healthy outlets for connection for people. And I think that this is ultimately what's going to stem the tide as far as people developing opioid use disorders or other type of substance use disorders. And that, psychedelics are incredibly promising, but they're really on the treatment side. And the kind of old adage that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of treatment, I think really still applies to this situation.
Makes me think of this gentleman I had a few conversations with. Name's Justin Hoffman. He's in Vegas. Big DJ, I think. I think he used to DJ for HBO boxing matches or something. But living in Vegas for that long, you're bound to get in a little bit of trouble here and there. I think he became hooked on pills, opiates, and eventually got clean through Ibogaine. But he founded this place called Holistic House. I think there's a few places like this popping up all over too. But the concept is you need kind of a fair amount of aftercare and some sort of soft landing pad so you can kind of re-imprint healthy patterns and not just, like you said, jump back into the toxic landscape you came from. A lot of this stuff comes from weird relationships and, trying to hang out with the same crew after, even though they're probably all on pills too. But this place teaches you how to eat well, what foods are healthy, treating you on that end and giving you an exercise habit, and also teaching you interesting skills like breathwork and Kundalini yoga. So you have like a method for kind of state change. So if you're not feeling good or feeling at risk, you can go do these exercises and kind of change your state legally and healthfully, I hope. and have a positive result. I think stuff like that's really interesting. So like you finish your treatment, you land somewhere for a week or two, and then you go back home, maybe. I think a lot more people should consider moving. Like, okay, you've been in this suburb and you have all these kind of people that could suck you into a black hole. Maybe you need to move 50 plus miles away so you're not with them every day. Scary. But
yeah. I mean, I think everyone's addiction recovery looks a little bit different in the amount of support that they need both before and after the experience, and that having these aftercare recovery programs or options are pretty important for people. As far as the comment regarding moving, it's really interesting because I've definitely had this same thought process before that, why not, why, it's like meet people and it's kind of maybe bogged down, like you said, by relationships that are close to them in their hometown, and maybe they've never experienced a different place to live and things like that. So there's probably certainly merits to your point about moving away and trying to experience something new. Although I will say that in my practice, I have come across quite a few people that end up in crisis because they did decide to move abruptly, and there are all sorts of stressors associated with picking up your stuff and going to a new place that for some people the stress of that big of a change can also be difficult to manage. So yeah, I think you're right as far as we're kind of walking a fine line between, we don't really necessarily want to send everyone back to the exact same place that they came from as far as their life, but also making sure that the changes that do occur are incremental enough that the stress isn't overwhelming for the person either.
Yeah, it's a really, when I look at how people talk about addiction in the mainstream, it's just really troubling because there's so much subtlety around this concept. And I had close friends tell me stuff like, we should just stop having EMTs carry naloxone so the addicts will die. So like there's this harshness happening in the mainstream that we're like really going to need to battle through knowledge. Like the work of Gabor Mate about, like, you might have some opinions on it as you're kind of more of a professional than I am, but trauma informing addiction or leading to addiction, and it's really not the person's fault in a lot of ways. It's just kind of the way primates work, mammals work in a lot of ways. It's really sad. Do you have any thoughts on that whole trauma model leading to addiction? Or I know it might be a little outside your scope, but
well, it certainly seems that when you experience stress, whether it's from a pre-existing trauma or not, that stress makes the body want to do something about it, and people go to a variety of different things to cope, and that could be something healthy like yoga or breath work, or it could be something like pills, or it could be something like cupcakes and potato chips. And I think kind of to your point is that there's so much stigma around drug use compared to some of these other coping modalities, in that if you use opiates or heroin and you like you said, there's the attitude out there, well, it's like, like they're just kind of a leech on society, and if they overdose, why would we want to bring them back? It's just kind of running up the taxpayer bill, and they're just unpleasant people to have around, so why not just let them go, right? And that kind of attitude just really demonstrates to me how stigmatized drug use is in society, because I meet very few people that are advocating to, let the diabetic that eats cupcakes go ahead and die, or let the person with heart failure that still has too much salt in their diet go ahead and die. Or, I could create a bunch of other parallel examples. As really anyone that's doing a behavior that's negative for their health and is aware that they have that health condition, we should, as society, just just go ahead and give up on them and wash our hands clean of it. And I'm sure it just sounds insane to you that we would do that, but for some reason with drugs, people in their minds really do have this type of attitude. And there's so much groundwork to be done, not only in the field of mental illness, because there's so much stigmatization in mental illness itself, but drugs of addiction or addiction itself is highly stigmatized. And then the drugs that we're talking about treating these illnesses with are highly stigmatized as well. So, there is so much as far as dispelling disinformation and kind of just shining the light of awareness in this these subjects that would really help us kind of approach the problems a lot more objectively instead of from this kind of twisted perspective.
Yeah, it's quite the situation, and I hope we as a culture can navigate it skillfully. I know from the global perspective, it looks really ugly, but in North America, I think we're making progress, even though it doesn't feel that way all the time. Looks that way when you look at everything that's happening. So I really am optimistic about Ibogaine in the U.S. at least, because people are looking for something to improve treatment, and hopefully once they get involved in the Ibogaine world a little bit more, they understand that treating addiction is a little bit more complicated than just one drug being administered. It really needs to be looked at in a systemic approach, and let's hope that happens. Before we jump from Ibogaine, is there any kind of last words you want to maybe say about it?
I guess just if you do have opioid use disorder, you are struggling with opioids, I wouldn't recommend doing Ibogaine detoxification at home because of the kind of risks that we've discussed earlier in the show, and that although it could be incredibly frustrating to kind of deal with the mainstream medical system and whatnot, if you're really considering Ibogaine, then I would be as above board with my physician as I possibly could be, and ask him to do a physical, do an EKG, do the types of things that would really be, I think, reassuring if you were to seek treatment in overseas or in some other jurisdiction where Ibogaine is not illicit or illegal, that you're being kind to yourself and that you're being as safe as you can, because although this has a lot of promise, there really is sort of the Wild West out there as far as psychedelic treatment centers, and this is an unregulated area of medicine. And any time that something is unregulated, there's potential for healing, but also the potential for some bad actors. So just be very careful out there and stay safe.
Yeah, definitely stay safe. I think we all know of people who have been hurt by drugs, including this one. So be careful out there, guys. It's not a walk in the park, and it's not a fun psychedelic. Don't do this if you're just trying to have a good time. It's not fun. Okay, so earlier we talked a little bit, before we started recording even, we talked a little bit about other drugs. And, given your position at the university, you might have some things to say about it. One thing that came up last year, I think Brett Green from Symposia raised the idea at Horizons NYC last year to Amanda Fielding about the properties of LSD being a 5-HT2A agonist could potentially cause thickening of a heart valve. Do you know anything about this concept of drugs that are this kind of agonist contributing to this kind of an issue, or just vague issues like this in general across the board with all drugs?
Yeah, so the stuff with heart valves and serotonin drugs kind of dates back to actual dietary prescription drugs from the 90s. There was this drug called fen-phen, which is a combination drug between phentermine, which is actually still on the market as a weight loss drug, and fenfluramine. And fenfluramine, it seemed, was thickening heart valves to the point that people were, basically developing, a form of heart failure because of it, and was subsequently pulled from the market. And it's it's actually not the serotonin 2A receptor that we think is responsible for heart valve thickening. It's the serotonin 2B receptor. And, I guess to your point is that these psychedelics like LSD or potentially others as well are serotonin agonists, or meaning that they stimulate serotonin receptors. And it seems that from different pharmacology experiments, we're fairly sure that the serotonin 2A receptor is the receptor that mediates most of the psychedelic experience or psychedelic phenomena. But, if a drug like LSD also binds to the serotonin 2B receptor, is there a risk of heart valve thickening with the use of LSD? And I'm not sure that I really have a definitive answer, although I do think that LSD has been around for, I don't know, since at least the 50s or 60s, and was fairly heavily used by people without necessarily coming across a lot of people that had heart valve thickening types of problems. I would say that with fen-phen, it was chronic administration. You had to take the drug every day for somewhere between, I think around 6 months was the time frame that caused heart valve thickening. So I do think if you're the kind of person that uses LSD once or twice a year, the risk of having a heart valve thickening from something that's usually associated with chronic administration is probably pretty low. I think that the place that really needs more research and data around this heart valve thickening phenomena would be microdosing, because now you're advocating that a person take a drug not every day, but every second or third day, typically over kind of a longer period of time. So you're making the exposure a little bit more chronic, even though the doses that you're using are so much less. So that would be one area that I think probably needs some further research. But my gut instinct is that if it was really as bad as fenfluramine, then we probably would have discovered that already.
Do you know how long people were doing it before they saw it with fen-phen and fenfluramine?
I think it was about 6 months of
Wow.
daily administration. So that's actually not very long as far as a chronic drug toxicity. Only 6 months worth of time. But perhaps the saving grace for psychedelics, if they do this at all, is that no one's really advocating for chronic or daily use, and it seems that most of the current research and protocols are focused on a very few number of administrations, all spaced fairly far apart.
That's really interesting. And I had that same thought, and Amanda Fielding had the same thing. She's like, I used LSD daily for decades, was her line. My heart's fine. She's a very prominent duchess in England with plenty of access to medical care, so I'm sure her heart is fine. So, she would have been a very good example of a canary in a coal mine for this kind of thing happening. And same with every deadhead out there through the 60s and 70s. So I'm a little less fearful, but you're right about microdosing being the possible method through which this could happen, but we don't know. Maybe somebody's doing research. We'll find out, I guess.
I think I did come across one case report of heart valve thickening of I believe it was a gentleman that had been using MDMA, I think on a weekly basis for about 10 years.
Whoa.
And, obviously that's kind of way outside of the pattern of use that you would normally see with MDMA. And I'm actually surprised that he could use it weekly for that long without suffering some type of nervous breakdown or something before that, because MDMA tends to deplete serotonin stores in nerve terminals. But I think it's just kind of perhaps a lesson as far as, LSD, is there a huge risk of heart valve thickening? I think we should test it, but my gut instinct is not really. I think where I'm a little less sure is all of these novel or designer types of psychedelics that are coming onto the market right now, because these typically are phenylethylamines, and fenfluramine is a phenylethylamine, whereas LSD is a tryptamine. So maybe the pharmacology of some of these new designer stimulant alpha-betamine types of compounds are a little bit closer to fenfluramine than LSD is, and they are completely untested or mostly untested as far as what their effect on pharmacology is, and whether some of these drugs may actually have some really real risks of something like heart valve thickening that perhaps something like LSD that we have 50 years of, I guess, observational experience as far as people recreationally or ceremonially or therapeutically using LSD out there in the world. But some of these new drugs, we have absolutely none of that. So, more than being scared of heart valve thickening with LSD, I would be scared with some of the newer synthetic drugs that we don't really have this kind of long-term observational reports of people taking it over decades.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think there's reason to be cautious, absolutely. With these compounds that have only been around for 15, 20 or less years, like, really, should we be doing them? I watched this show the other day on, what were they calling it? Mamba, like K2 or Spice, like these synthetic cannabinoids, and like the addiction risk was really intense. I couldn't believe it. So I think it goes to show that there's some very scary things that could happen from research chemicals, quote unquote, that are on the market. So speaking of them, I'm very curious about 2CB. Have you seen any data or interesting things about 2CB out there? I think it's one of the more common shulgin compounds that are really just made their way onto the market kind of permanently. I don't think they've made their way into the lab yet, but perhaps I'm wrong.
Yeah, I haven't really seen a whole lot out there as far as lab studies with 2CB. No, I think that this comes really just from kind of my dance safe knowledge of 2CB, is that the dosing curve on the 2C compounds tends to almost sort of be exponential, in that some drugs, it's sort of like, well, if you double the amount that you take, you can expect roughly double the effect. Whereas the 2C compound seems that, just going from something like 25 to 30 milligrams, or maybe even 25 to something like 27 or 28 milligrams, can have quite a large difference in the intensity of the experience. So, I think with research compounds in general, to the point of this conversation, there's probably a lot of risk, or maybe not a lot, but more risk than some of the other psychedelics like psilocybin that have been kind of used for time immemorial and come from a fungus source. Usually, I kind of lost my train of thought there.
It's okay. No, like these ancient-ish molecules that have been around, for many thousands of years, if not millions of years, we might be adapted to them versus these new things.
So I guess, you could look at it from really pharmacy in general. Like, what is pharmacy about? And, there's certainly a lot of people that would, jump on that and say, well, a pharmacy is about pushing pharmaceutical products or getting in bed with the drug company or something like that. And it's really, in its essence, pharmacy is about two things. It's about safety. That's probably the first thing. And it's about efficacy. So it's like, does the drug work, and can you make it work in a way that's safe, is kind of really the crux of it all. So if you look at, why do we even have a drug development process? Like, why was this even put in place, in the first place? Why do we require clinical trials? And it really kind of traces back to safety and efficacy. In the early part of the 20th century, there was a lot of people selling snake oil out there. And it kind of got to the point that the FDA was like, hey, you know what? We should test these things, and you should have to demonstrate that it works better than a placebo before you're allowed to make claims about how good it works and things like that. And then the 50s came, and they had thalidomide, and wow, they had an incredible morning sickness drug until the babies that were born had deformed limbs. And that's when the FDA was kind of like, you know what, maybe we should test safety as well as just whether the drug works. So this kind of paradigm of drug development for, what it is. And, there's certainly elements of the drug approval and regulation processes that I don't agree with, but I do think that this idea of having some type of standard of safety and efficacy for drugs before you use them in people is a responsible idea. So when you kind of look at what's happening with research chemicals, where you kind of have this international game of whack-a-mole, where one drug is made illegal and then the next analog is released, and it kind of keeps going in this sort of cat and mouse game between underground manufacturers and law enforcement. It sort of is really thwarting a lot of the process that we have in place for testing both safety and kind of efficacy. And it's kind of creating, in my mind, a real double-edged sword, because on the one hand, obviously, you have the potential for a total public health disaster with one of these analog compounds that do something that we're really not prepared for. But on the other hand, you have, oftentimes tens of thousands or maybe millions of people testing a drug on themselves that would have normally had to be tested in rodents with all sorts of permits, and then maybe you can use it in a healthy person, and then maybe. So it's actually in some ways potentially really accelerating a drug development process, which is, I don't know, I guess I have a master's in public health, so I would have to say that for me, the potential for a public health disaster probably outweighs any benefit of, trying to just test it on yourself before you test it on anything else. But at the same time, I can see perhaps an unintended consequence of just kind of random drug taking is that you could actually hit gold a lot quicker than if you were, screening a library of compounds with animals and kind of going through the traditional pathways or channels.
Right. Ibogaine's an example of that. I'm wondering in a lot of ways, like, how could we leverage, I think we're seeing it actually. People are doing more survey studies now to get people to self-report on their drug use. And I think, for instance, if we had better access to something like Erowid's data set, or like a site where you could actually do reporting, you could really do some interesting analytics off of, thousands of drug reports, drug sessions. And, that does shortcut like decades and millions of dollars in funding for certain types of research. And I think some really interesting stuff could come from that if we figured out how to unlock that data. Have you seen anything like that? People trying to kind of report against existing data sets and sites like Erowid?
Yeah, so that's definitely an interesting idea as far as like, I don't even know if you would need to, if you just came up with some type of criteria for coding or kind of creating a theme out of Erowid reports, you could kind of just go ahead and go through their site and come up with something the way it is. And yeah, I do think that, reporting is a great way to kind of get an idea of what's going on. I do usually take those types of reporting surveys with a grain of salt, and I think it probably, it's difficult to tell. Every survey has some level of bias to it, and my suspicion is that when it comes to reporting surveys, you're probably more likely to get people reporting good experiences than not so good experiences. And I kind of say that because I think that the people that have good experiences are the people that tend to maybe plug in with a culture a little bit more, and that they are on these Facebook groups that discuss psychedelics, or are kind of signed up for newsletters through the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies and things like that. So when these surveys are launched, they're typically launched through the types of channels that probably select for people that are supporters of psychedelic use, rather than just everyone in the United States population that may have encountered a psychedelic in their time. So it kind of like, I always take it with a grain of salt when I read a survey that's sort of like, we gathered 100 trip reports and 98 of them were positive, so that means that it's positive 98% of the time. I kind of feel that some of the negative experiences are probably slipping through the cracks, in that if you have a negative experience with psychedelics, you're probably not likely to sign up for newsletters and sign up for every Facebook group, and in fact you may want to distance yourself from that type of space, which would make you a missed data point. So I think that surveys are a fantastic place to start, because we have to start somewhere, but eventually something with less potential for a selection bias is probably going to be better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's like a nice preliminary data set for people like yourself or researchers to then design studies to test certain things. So you could, recruit 1,000 people with a $10 gift card or whatever, and then if they meet your criteria, then you run them through the research or something. So yeah, it's an interesting way to go about it. I think there's some promise there if people choose to get resourceful with the data that's out there. There's probably some interesting studies that are a lot cheaper to do than some randomly controlled trials of double-blind placebo stuff. Like, we can still get a lot of data that's useful without doing the most expensive type of research, I think. Maybe that's what's the best way to phrase it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly what those types of studies are for, is for generating an evidence base, for generating something that you can, justify a hypothesis for some funded research from.
So let's see here. Are you seeing any particular promise that's being under-discussed in the psychedelic field right now? Like any particular researchers doing something that's amazing that nobody's talking about?
I'm not sure if I have an answer for that question.
It's okay. It's a little far out.
Yeah, am I seeing anything that I wish there was a lot more of? One thing that I think is missing from this, there's so much to do with, obviously, MDMA and psilocybin through Hefter Research Institute and MAPS. But, ayahuasca has so much support behind it right now, and they actually are doing some really kind of high-level research in a couple of labs around the world. But one that is just missing from the kind of research portfolio right now is mescaline and San Pedro or peyote. And, I'm kind of scratching my head and wondering why, because it is a classic psychedelic, and it was, very famously written about in Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, and is an official sacrament of the Native American Church. And I know that there's a lot of issues of cultural appropriation when you're taking some of these traditional sacraments and wanting to test them in a lab, but it seems like it really hasn't slowed down ayahuasca research so much. But there seems to be very little interest in doing the same types of studies or research with mescaline. And it's always kind of been a mystery to me why, because, for exactly time immemorial, it really has been something that humans have used to connect with the divine.
Yeah, that is interesting. I've been more and more curious about mescaline lately. Peyote makes me a little nervous conceptually, just thinking about doing it. San Pedro seems a little more comfortable, but synthetic mescaline, like a pure mescaline, seems like a lot less scary than something like I can't say ayahuasca is really scary. It's kind of comfortable, but maybe it's scary. For whatever reason, mescaline just seems under-researched, even though it was one of the first things that hit the scene. It was there before LSD. I think it was even in Western culture before psilocybin, perhaps, but I'm not 100% on that. Isn't the dude Hefter, the German chemist that Hefter Institute was named after, the first guy to isolate mescaline?
Oof, jeez.
I'll pull it up right
question.
now. I don't need to ask you that.
Yeah.
Hefter mescaline. I think he was. So I'll just leave it at that. But I don't know. Like, why are people not researching mescaline? That's a really interesting question. It has a deep spiritual culture to it, but I haven't heard anything about healing from mescaline from many people.
I mean, there's certainly some anthropologic type of anecdotes that demonstrate or suggest that peyote helps more than one Native American deal with alcoholism or something along those lines. So again, I'm not really sure exactly why there's less interest, or perhaps maybe it's more difficult to do research with peyote or San Pedro or mescaline. But there's just not as much happening with it.
Right. So back to Hefter here. Arthur Hefter from Germany. He was a pharmacologist and chemist, came up with the Handbook of Experimental Pharmacology, and he isolated mescaline from peyote in 1897. So that's pretty early. It seemed like it's kind of like the proto-Shulgin, maybe.
Yeah. It's sort of the golden age of pharmacology, really. Maybe not 1890 something, but it really seemed that, for a long time, pharmacology was about finding something or synthesizing something and then taking it. That's just what they all did. And, somewhere along the way, we decided that that's too risky or too scary, and that that you should really do all these other things preceding taking it yourself.
Yeah.
I don't know, did have to take it himself? Maybe he didn't.
It's very interesting. I wonder, like why. I think people had a different value of life back then. People were far more willing to jump into a war at that, in that series of decades as well, than they are today. So I wonder what that is.
Yeah, something to do with the comforts and amenities of modern life have somehow made us a lot more risk averse. And, for better or worse, maybe that means we live longer and get sick less often. But, maybe that means that, we all kind of struggle with this sort of existential boredom because your life's not on the line all the time. I'm not sure.
I've been, I don't know that I shared this in the show yet. I've been reading a lot of books on war lately just to like wrap my head around it a little bit more because it's such a foreign concept to me. But in short, what I'm seeing is these are the most, for the people who live, it's the most full of life experience that they have because of that. Yeah, your life is on the line thing. And constantly and very, very literally, your life is on the line for so long, and you're bonding with these people. Kind of see a little touch of that in that Stealing Fire book about flow states. I don't know. Have you seen that book?
I've listened to, I don't know, I would estimate about half of it on audiobook, and really, really fantastic writing. It's really thrilling to listen to, honestly. I get excited every time we listen to a chapter in the car.
It's cool, right? Like what the fundamental thing they're boiling down to is flow states. And, there's now a science around flow states and how to bring them back. And I think that's really kind of interesting and could be really revolutionary for mental health care and, betterment of well people.
Yeah, and it's all kind of mixed together, right? Like you're talking about war, and you're talking about, okay, well, there's flow states and potentially like near-death experience, which, on the one hand, you could say, wow, like, a lot of people that have near-death experience kind of gives them a renewed sense for living.
Right.
But at the same time, war is so traumatic, and we see so many people coming back with PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. So, yeah, certainly in an extreme environment like war, there's so much that's possible in the way of a psychological outcome. In that, it's like, for some people, perhaps it makes them feel more alive than anything else, and for, I would guess, the majority of people, it's absolutely terrifying and results in a lot of trauma. But
right, it's this weird balancing act of like, you might feel the most fulfilled you've ever felt in your life, but you also could live for the next couple decades really fragmented and shattered.
Well, I mean, I went to a shooting range one time, and I kind of felt like a golden retriever on the 4th of July, or around the gunshots. I felt like kind of just running away and hiding underneath a bed or something like that. So I'm not really sure if I've got the Rambo spirit in me. I think I'm kind of more on the spectrum of, I would find it traumatizing, but
Right. You got to start them young, just like with dogs, I guess. But
oh, well, it seems like America starts them young, and I don't know how well it's working.
Yeah, who knows? The machine seems to be working okay for now until the taxes run out. We'll see. Anyway, we're going off track here, and we've been going for about an hour. I guess we can wrap. Is there anything you'd like to share with people before we kind of wrap?
Sure. Yeah. I guess that I would say is that, from the perspective of a pharmacist, I see something like MDMA or psilocybin entering the last phase of clinical trials. And, certainly, we'll see how things go, but they seem fairly poised for success. And that means that there's going to be big changes to practice coming down the pike in the next 10 or 15 years, and possibly even shorter, possibly like 5 years. And with this, there's going to be a need to potentially integrate or switch between traditional therapeutic modalities and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies, because really the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies like MDMA or psilocybin seemed like they're kind of geared towards PTSD, anxiety, or depression, potentially addiction. But I would say, PTSD, anxiety, and depression are kind of the ones that have the most data behind them right now. And the first line drugs for those at the moment are antidepressants like SSRIs or SNRIs. And it seems that these drugs kind of blunt psychedelic experiences. So I think that there's going to be a great need in the near future for clinical expertise as far as transitioning people from one type of therapy to another. And that's one thing that I think that I'm interested in working in as far as determining what kind of a best practice should be for optimizing the efficacy of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies, and of course, minimizing any potential risks. It's very preliminary right now, but it is up and running. I do have a personal website called spiritpharmacist.com. So if anyone from the listenership of the podcast wanted to get a hold of me, they could go to spiritpharmacist.com, and there's a contact page there that they could fill out. And again, it's kind of a shell of a website right now, but it's based upon the idea that drugs are more than just physical. They're more than just, they can reduce your blood pressure or cholesterol. And they're even more than emotional or cognitive types of effects, in that they can have spiritual effects or induce spiritual types of experiences, and that there's a lot of potential benefit that can stem from one of these drug-induced spiritual states. So I think those are the main projects that I have going on right now as far as developing this website, and kind of thinking about ways in which psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies could be well integrated into kind of traditional psychiatric care.
Yeah, that's great. Well, glad to hear you have a website now, and I will be sending fair amount of folks over there. So Dr. Ben Malcolm, thanks for your time today, and looking forward to connecting again soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joe. It's been a pleasure chatting.